Fall is my absolute favorite time of year. I'm excited that the weather is cooling off, and I've already started wearing my coziest sweaters. My heather gray Mongolian cashmere sweater from Quince was the first thing I pulled out of my closet as soon as the weather turned cooler. It's soft and warm and so stylish. I wore it all the time last winter and it's still in great shape. $50 is an unbelievable price for a cashmere sweater like this. Quince delivers luxury quality pieces at half the price of similar brands because they cut out the middleman and partner directly with top-tier ethical factories. Layers are the name of the game this time of year. If you need a new winter coat, they have beautiful coats and jackets. They have everything you need for your wardrobe this fall, as well as beautiful linens, bags, and home decor. Pretty much everything you need for your home and wardrobe. Find your fall staples at Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
What does it mean to live and love the questions of our lives, particularly in this world that we live in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers? And what I've come to find the definition of living the questions is it's this method of truth seeking that allows you to kind of break through the paralysis of uncertainty, to get kind of unstuck from that feeling of, I can't move forward because I don't have the answers, into a place where you can actually let the questions move you forward.
That was Elizabeth Weingarten on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Mac Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of Act Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Elizabeth Weingarten is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist who works at the intersection of science and storytelling. She has worked on the editorial staffs of The Atlantic, Slate, and Qatar Today, and she was managing editor of Behavioral Scientist. Her writing has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Slate, CNN, Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and Time. Elizabeth has led research programs at the think tank New America, the consultancy Ideas 42, and the tech companies Torch and Udemy. Her Substack is titled Time Travel for Beginners. She lives in Northern California with her husband and son. Her fantastic new book is titled How to Fall in Love with Questions, a New Way to Thrive in Times of Uncertainty. And before we get started, just a quick reminder to stick around after the interview for my Potsy post-host discussion with Yael to hear her take on authenticity and binary questions.
Welcome to the show, Elizabeth. This is such an honor. I'm so looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And same here. I'm so excited to be here.
So a topic that's like no one's favorite topic at any dinner conversation, uncertainty. This is something that we humans tend to not like too much. And I was just having a thought around this before we started talking. And I was thinking about uncertainty, and I realized two things that might necessitate that we narrow this like theme of uncertainty down a little bit. And the first thing about uncertainty is that I am uncertain about most things in life all the time. Like you could ask me a million questions and I wouldn't be able to answer any of them. The mass of Neptune, the speed of light, whatever. I'm totally uncertain about those things and I don't care. And then There's this other uncertainty that I actually pay money to experience in the cinema, with a novel, with an audiobook, with a movie, with a video game. I pay to experience uncertainty. And then there is this tiny little subset of uncertainty that drives me bonkers. And that's also the uncertainty that your book is about. So how come that it's just those couple of, I want to say like 20, 30, 50 questions that are so uncertain that they keep me up at night?
So you've done a beautiful job of articulating what's so interesting about uncertainty. This, on the one hand, right, the world is a very uncertain place. We don't know the answer to so many questions. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really affect our lives. And then there are, to your point, the things that we get excitement from kind of uncertainty. So whether it's, a show that you're watching or a book or a movie and you don't know the end, but that's fun. That's kind of a experience of joy. But then what you're talking about and what I talk about in my book are these kind of big questions, the big life questions about meaning, love, relationships, loss, purpose. These questions that in a lot of cases fundamentally don't have answers, or if they do have answers, they're answers that are evolving across the course of our lives. And I think this question of why do those keep us up at night? Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One is, in a word, these questions are the questions that define who we are, right? And kind of what kind of lives we live. They're the questions that couldn't be higher stakes in a way, right? And a couple of the questions that I write about in the book, and the book kind of emerged for me from questions about my relationship, questions about my career, questions in particular where I was questioning if I was with the right person. I was also questioning, what I was doing with my life. And we can talk a little bit more in depth about those questions shortly. But I don't think you get much higher stakes than these kind of big questions that are keeping us up at night. So that's kind of like one answer. But then the second answer is we as humans are really wired to want to avoid uncertainty and choose certainty. And one theory is called selfish brain theory, which basically posits that when food was scarcer and when humans were evolving, right, because uncertainty just takes more calories, more kind of metabolic energy, we didn't want to choose an uncertain situation, right? It was more energy intensive. So you're going to want to choose something, choose an experience that's more certain. And so for that reason, uncertainty just feels more aversive for us, in part because it just takes more energy. So we're always trying to choose that less energy intensive path. So I think there's a kind of a biological reason for why these things keep us up at night, why they feel so aversive, why we feel so anxious. And then there's also this just kind of more intuitive reason of these questions are so important. They completely define and change who we are and who we're becoming.
Totally. It's the least costly mistake as well with the uncertainty when, you're a caveman and you're sitting in your little cave and there's a sound outside. This is not the time to wonder whether you might find like a cute little kitten out there. This is the time to, hunker down and stay in the corner. You've talked about different types of questions, and you have a really beautiful metaphor in your book for those different types of questions. And I think it's going to be important to set us up by knowing about like what kinds of questions we could be talking about here.
Yes, absolutely. So the questions that you referenced early on, these questions that keep us up at night, the big questions, they fall into this framework that I describe in the book that actually connects to different parts of a fruit tree. So if you bear with me for a second, because people might be listening and thinking, what are you talking about? But if you think about questions as these things in our lives that eventually, in many cases, ripen into answers. So that's kind of the central idea that we're running with. The first type of question that you might think about is a peach style question. So peaches, we know they ripen pretty quickly into answers. And a peach style question might be, will I get the job, right? So you're going to find out on a fairly short timeline the answer to that question. The second type of question is a pawpaw question. And something that I learned when I was doing some reporting and researching for the book is that pawpaw trees take 5 to 7 years to actually produce ripe fruit. So these are questions that you're going to get the answer to, but maybe it's going to take a little bit longer. So maybe you're asking a question about whether a career transition is going to be something that is fulfilling to you, or maybe it's a fertility treatment, or is it going to lead to you being able to have a child? The third type of question, and this is maybe the type of question that we were really talking about earlier, is the heartwood style question. Now, heartwood is the part of the tree that stays with it through its entire life. It's the core of the tree. So the heartwood is the part of the tree that kind of lends it stability and helps the tree kind of come to equilibrium. And so I loved this idea, and I loved this idea of having these questions that really stay with you and that evolve as you evolve. And so these are the questions about who am I? Who am I becoming? Questions about, what it takes for you to live a meaningful and fulfilling life. The fourth final part of this questions tree are dead leaves. And these are the questions that fundamentally you kind of have to let go of, right? They're questions that are no longer serving you. Maybe they're keeping you locked in patterns of regret and rumination. It's the kind of, why didn't I do this? Or why did I do this? These questions that are keeping you stuck in the past, right? Instead of questions that are helping you move forward into new possibilities for your life. So those are the four kind of components of the questions tree.
So with the dead leaves questions, those are questions that will never bear an answer. And at the same time, we have to let go of them as well because they're not helping us. Did I get that right?
And that's exactly right. Yes.
Hey, it's Michael with a quick announcement. As you might have heard, I'm writing this book about building confidence and finding meaningful connections. Last year, I invited a small group of podcast listeners to be a part of that process. Back then, I thought this would be a one-time experiment, but we had so much fun and I got to meet so many awesome people that I'm doing it again this year. So if you're feeling stuck in your comfort zone, unhappy with your social life, or unsure how to really show up in conversations, I would love to help. We would work together one-on-one for 8 weeks to help you build the kind of confidence that actually lasts. And if you're up for it, I may include a few small moments from our work in my book, or completely anonymously, of course, to help others feel a little less alone in their own process. And as a thank you, I'm offering 50% off my coaching package. If this sounds like a fit, head over to herald.coach/book and get in touch. That's all. Back to the episode.
So I see us going down two potential roads through your fruit tree garden at this time. I'll let you pick where we start. On one side, of course, I want to look at answers. Like two of the fruits are find answers, either in the short term or in the long term. There's an answer. We're good. Okay, perfect. Let's move on. And the counterintuitive thing here is that sometimes us looking for an answer is actually a problem and can lead us down a metaphorical rabbit hole in that fruit tree garden that we might actually maybe even want to stay away from. So we have the counterintuitive aspect of answers. And on the other side, this counterintuitive question of when we have a question that is by its nature unanswerable, the heartwood question, how does that serve us?
Gosh, I love those two paths. Let me back up for a second, and then maybe I'll take a slightly circuitous route to get there. Because I think, the kind of fundamental thing to understand about the book is that it really is designed to help people get unstuck from the experience of uncertainty. And that experience that you were describing early on of, there's this question that's keeping me up at night, it's tormenting me. And I think what I do want to bring into the conversation is a definition of uncertainty that I really appreciated and found early on when I was writing the book. And it's a sense of doubt that stops or delays progress. And I think that's really important to get grounded in, right? Because when we think about why are some of these questions so difficult for us to grapple with? Mm-hmm. And part of it is because when we don't know the answer, we feel like we can't move forward in our life. We feel like we have to stay stuck, that this question is kind of an anchor, right? That's kind of holding us back from progress. And so the counterintuitive part of answers is that, yes, sometimes answers can help us move forward, but it kind of depends on how we're going about seeking that answer, and whether we see an answer as kind of the final destination on the path, or if it's an answer that we see as, maybe a path into a new and different or better question. And the piece about answers that I get into in the book is, it's always been hard for us to appreciate the big questions in our lives and to kind of love these questions. And we can talk a little bit about that too, and the title of the book and where that comes from. But it's been especially challenging in this world that we live in, where so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, it's not that when I talk about kind of the counterintuitive nature of answers, it's not the answers that you come to after a long period of reflection, after sitting with a question for a long time and really, maybe you're talking it through with other people and you're really exploring and reflecting. But often it's the times when we're sitting with a question, the uncertainty is so uncomfortable. So maybe it's a question like, did I marry the right person? Am I in the right relationship? Maybe it's a question about your career, your purpose. Maybe it's a question about, living with an illness. And instead of sitting with that question, we are immediately trying to seek out sources external to us, right? So whether it's kind of an influencer guru type figure who makes you feel like they have all the answers to your questions, and it's just this like 5-step hack, right? And if you do this, all of your questions will be answered, and everything will be solved in your life, and you'll be happy and healthy and wealthy. And so I think we live in a culture where we're being fed a lot of that, what I would kind of call like overly kind of processed information, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, sometimes it's less about the pursuit of a particular answer and more about the question itself, asking like, are we asking the right question in the first place? And are we asking the right question of the right source and at the right time? So I think the counterintuitive part about searching for answers is not necessarily the answers themselves, but the context around that search for the answer. So really getting grounded first in the question that you're asking and who you are asking that question of, and when in this kind of process of your own kind of journey and becoming.
This reminds me so much of what happens often in the first session or two of coaching, where people come to me and they want these very precise answers of, hey, Michael, if X, Y, and Z happens precisely in that way, what do I do? And no, sorry, like I'm not going to give you an answer to that, because I don't want to turn you into, a copy of Michael, a stunt Michael, if you will. I want you to answer that question yourself. And my job as the coach is to guide you with questions so that you find your own either better questions to ask than, hey, what do I do in precisely this situation? But now I have a better question that I can ask myself, or will give you better questions to think about in the first place. And very often, or sometimes not even that, people would then either come up with their own answers, or they will, and we'll get to that in a bit, live the question as they go through life. Living your question can start in the realm that I work in by people, for example, questioning themselves how they can bring their personal values into a situation. So they show up by saying, hey, Michael, like, I don't know, I went to a party or I was at a networking event at work and then I kind of screwed this up and was standing in the corner. What do I do next time? And then instead of like being told what to do next time, we find their values and how that would like look when they go through that event the next time, and how bringing in those values would then look like for them. So I think they might even end up with more questions than before, but they are the right kind of questions. They are those questions that actually can inform, like the heartwood, can inform behavior afterwards.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important. And one of the kind of stories that I tell in the book is about how even though I don't believe in astrology as a predictive science in any way, I found myself going to astrologers to try to get answers to some of these really heavy, difficult questions in my life. And I think a lot of people go down that route, whether it's an astrologer or whether it's a therapist or coach or, somebody, and not to compare, these different groups of people, but I think the theme is the same, where we have a big question, right? And it can feel so lonely and scary to hold that question and kind of to be on that search for answers alone. And so it's not necessarily bad, right, to go to somebody else and to try to understand that question a little bit better, or kind of get some clarity on what you're actually seeking. But I think, to your point, the best coaches and therapists and even astrologists, right, are the people that help you understand what you're searching for.
So in your book, there's this season freeze. You find an answer. It seems to kind of work. And now, so you pick it. The uncertainty is out of the window. I found my answer. I cannot let any doubt creep in. This is the perfect answer. It's going to be the perfect answer forever. It's like, oh, Michael, like I can point at like 3 things where I did that last month, where I was so happy that I found some answer that I felt like I must fall in love with the answer, not the question. So that was really illuminating to see that I'm doing, this is not perfect. Sheesh.
I mean, here's the thing about writing this book, is that it was just like holding a mirror up to myself, every day. And I'm sure you know this from your practice too. It's like somebody, actually a coach once said this to me, your mess is your message. And I really liked that, because I think it's very much true for me. And you can read throughout the book my own kind of journey to trying to love the questions of my life and trying to kind of get unstuck from the uncertainty that had been holding me back. And it's a thing that I'm working on every single day. But what you're citing, that kind of seize and freeze terminology, that's from the psychologist Ari Kruglansky. And he was the one in the 90s who came up with essentially kind of a scientific scale for measuring something, what he called the need for cognitive closure. And this is the desire, kind of exists on a spectrum that any of us have for really wanting to know the answer to uncertainty, or wanting to resolve uncertainty in our lives. And it changes across different contexts. So, Michael, in a certain part of your life, you might feel really open to living with uncertainty. And in another part, you're like, no, I need to know the answer now. I need this cognitive closure. So it's less something that is kind of fixed, and more something that, depending on kind of the context and the environment that you're in, for instance, even if you're just feeling a sense of urgency, right? You're in a rush, you're probably going to have that higher need for closure in that moment than if you have all the time in the world, right? Or it might also be different if it's something that is scary to you versus something that's not. So there are all sorts of factors that can influence whether you're seizing and freezing on an answer. But I think it's so interesting and important to realize and to ask this question of like, when do I do this and when don't I do this? And are there variables? What are the kind of variables that come into play? And I think I try to do that for myself, right? It's less about like, I shouldn't do this, but, oh, this is interesting. I'm doing this right now. What is around me that might be creating that sense that I need to seize and freeze on an answer right now?
Yeah, the beautiful thing, the in air quotes, beautiful thing of the season freeze is that we finally have this moment of, like, this is decided.
To kind of bring it back to that questions framework, it's not always bad. It kind of depends on the question that we're asking, right? So, if you're, I'm a new parent, right? So I have constant questions all day about, what type of diapers should I be using, and
where's my baby?
Where's my baby? Right. There are certain questions that are answerable, right? And that you can seize and freeze on an answer, and it's probably a fine answer, and you don't have to like live the question of which type of puree should I buy today.
I should seize and freeze on my breakfast decision and not think about it for half an hour. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And so what we're talking about here are the questions, these heartwood questions, right? The questions that are just bigger. They are more demanding of us. They're higher stakes. They are rooted in these very significant life choices and experiences. And so the questions that you probably don't want to kind of quickly seize and freeze on an answer, and particularly when that answer comes from an external source, right? If you're asking a question about what to do in your relationship, ultimately, you can gather insights and advice from other people, but the answer probably has to come from you and from that other person, right? So I think when it comes to answers and which answers we take in and use, it does go back to the type of question that we're asking and what we expect from that question.
Yeah. And if we look for the answer on the outside, then we're often looking for a should instead of a want. Like, not what does Michael want, but what should Michael want, which is a recipe for disaster. I mean, if you ask what Michael wants, that's also a recipe for disaster, but at least I'm responsible for it. So one thing about uncertainty that really opened my eyes when I read about it in Kelly Wilson's book. One of the founding fathers of acceptance and commitment therapy wrote this amazing book called Things Might Go Terribly, Horribly Wrong, which would have been the title of my autobiography, but now I have to think of something else. He writes about this need for closure in an example that is it's almost heartbreaking. He writes about it in regards to substance abuse, smoking or drinking. And he says that when people stop abusing substance like that, there is one big uncertainty in their life, and that is, will I be able to stay clean? Will I be able? And that uncertainty is so painful at times. And there's only one answer, and that is to light a cigarette. It's the only way out of this uncertainty. And this is sort of like one of those points that, this is what uncertainty can do to us, that we sometimes choose pain and suffering over actually, in air quotes, just being uncertain.
It's true. And there's lots of research to suggest that we choose certainty over uncertainty, even when it causes pain or suffering, because we cannot stand to live in this world of not being sure of the outcomes. I think ultimately we want to feel like we have control over our lives and the outcomes in our lives. But I would say, what's interesting to me about that question, will I be able to stay clean, is that it's a binary question, right? It's a yes or no. And I can imagine too that question for some people may feel really unsettling because it's not actually giving you a lot of possibilities for what, a sober life could look like, or even giving you a lot of agency in terms of how you might approach kind of the experience that you're kind of trying to create for yourself in your life. And, one of the things, because I spoke to several people that had been through 12-step programs and that had also grappled with addiction. And from them and across many of the stories that I tell in the book, and I should say too, the book is really a combination of stories of real people and also a lot of kind of scientific insights woven in. One of the things that I learned was that binary questions often aren't the best questions for us to ask when we are feeling uncertainty. And part of that is because you have two answers, or maybe there's a maybe answer, but really you just have yes or no. And so what you want to try for when you're kind of sitting with these big questions that you ultimately are going to try to live or love in your life is to think about, is there a question that actually opens up more possibilities for me? And what would that question look like? And how could I think about that versus the binary question, which I think inherently can feel limiting. It can create a sense of narrowness and urgency that might contribute to you feeling worse in that state of uncertainty.
So you've given us the keywords, living the question and loving the question. So it's finally time to open the curtain on that important question, pun intended. What does it mean to live a question? And I know that this is also inspired by Rainer Maria Rilke and his letters to a young poet. But I'll let you tell the story and answer the question.
Yes, absolutely. So the book for me, it emerged during this time in my life that I've kind of alluded to a little bit when I was buckling under these very heavy questions. So questions about my marriage and my career. And the advice that I kept finding over and over again, and perhaps this advice will be familiar to you too, it's various pop psychology books and in talks and just everywhere, is that when you're dealing with these big questions, all you have to do is just embrace uncertainty. And yes, you're laughing. And I had the same kind of reaction, right? It's just like, thanks a lot. It's one thing to embrace uncertainty when you're watching a movie with an exciting ending, right? It's another thing to just embrace uncertainty when you are thinking about divorcing your partner, or when you're waiting on the results of genetic testing for a child, or when you're, dealing with a chronic illness. Like, those are times when I think that advice to just embrace uncertainty falls really flat and is just totally tone deaf. Luckily, around this time when I was grappling with these big questions, I discovered a much older book, which you alluded to, Letters to a Young Poet, which contained for me was much better and more helpful advice, if it wasn't actually more challenging advice. And so Letters to a Young Poet, for folks who are not familiar with it, it's a book of correspondence between the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke and this 19-year-old aspiring poet whose name was Franz Capus. It was written in the early 20th century. And it's a book that counts people like Lady Gaga, Dustin Hoffman, Marilyn Monroe among its fans. And what I found out doing research from the book is that Lady Gaga even has a line from it tattooed on her. So I would highly encourage folks to go out and read that book.
And then get a tattoo.
Yes, and get a tattoo, exactly. The whole book is really beautiful, but I was struck by this one part of it, which you alluded to. And it's this part where Capus is asking Rilke for all kinds of advice, not only about how to become a poet, but how to live his life. And Rilke very famously responds not with an answer per se, the kind of here's my step-by-step 5-step plan hack for living your best life, because he was not one of today's influencers, but instead he tells him how important it is to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a foreign language. And he advises Capus not to search for the answers right now, but talks about the importance of, to your point, living the questions. Rilke never exactly explains what he meant by living the questions now, or how to think about loving the questions. But that was really the journey for me, was what does it mean to live and love the questions of our lives, particularly in this world that we live in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers. And what I've come to find the definition of living the questions is it's this method of truth seeking that allows you to kind of break through the paralysis of uncertainty, to get kind of unstuck from that feeling of, I can't move forward because I don't have the answers, into a place where you can actually let the questions move you forward. The questions can guide you, not necessarily into answers, but into clarity. So to me, it's this way of kind of imbuing an experience that I think for many of us can be really kind of really stultifying, right? Into one where you have momentum, where you can actually grow. So that has become the way that I think about living the questions, and the way to understand loving the question. And this is maybe kind of goes back to why I think this is so much better than the advice to embrace uncertainty, is you kind of have to know a little bit about what Rilke thinks about love as well. And in other parts of his work, Rilke writes about the fact that love is the most difficult task that we undertake in our lives, but we must stay with what's difficult. And I think that, if you think about kind of the loving relationships in your life, this rings true in the sense that love is probably the most rewarding and challenging thing that we can do as humans. And I like that framing and this idea of loving the questions, because it gives you permission to feel lots of different ways about the uncertainty in your life, about these big questions. So on one day, just as you might feel this way about somebody who you love, you might really enjoy this particular question. It might be intriguing and exciting to you. On another day, you might not be able to stand the question, right? You might just be like, this sucks. I just want an answer. I hate this, right? Yeah. just in the way that our relationships with other people are complex and evolving, our relationships with our questions can be that way too. So I think on the one hand, while embrace uncertainty feels like it's kind of tinged with that, like almost like toxic positivity, right?
Yeah.
Like just always need to want to love, this like love it might sound similar, but to me, there's so much more kind of depth and nuance and complexity there when you think about the depth and nuance and complexity of love, and what it means to love someone or something like a question across your life and to really commit to that question.
There's also a quality of behavior that I can associate with the word love, to love something. If you ask me how it would look like behaviorally to embrace uncertainty, I kind of know what you're, but I couldn't describe it. But and this sounds weird as I'm saying it, but when you say like love the question, I know what that would feel like, because I know what love feels like. And I don't have to just love my family and my friends. I can also love my smartphone, my favorite toy, my favorite book. I can love that stuff as well. I'm not sure if I got this from Kelly Wilson as well, but the quote that comes to mind is that you can't like every person, but you can love every person. And there is truth to that. It sounds weird. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's truth to that. I can be in the subway and can be annoyed by everyone, and I can't like them, but I can find it in me to love everyone as well. And I'm taking that quality of behavior and I'm transplanting it onto that question that keeps me up at night. And that is much easier than to embrace this freaking uncertainty, which usually, if it's uncertain, it's going to, eat me at one point. But if it's just a question, it's going to guide me somewhere. And this was a massive revelation in your book for me. Like, this was the main takeaway from me from that book, was that, so I'm going to explain that in my words, how I understood it, but you described it basically the same way, that when I'm asking myself a question, I'm answering it in the here and now with what I have and what I am and what I can do. But what you invite us to do is to think about the person that we actually want to become, the potential that we carry, the person that we want to be, and then answer the question with that person in mind. A dear friend of mine and previous guest on the show, Dr. Russell Colts, he told me once, trust future Michael to solve the problem. Like, he's going to be capable. Like, he's a badass. I think that's what he said, at least in my memory. He said something like, no, Michael, you're a total badass, but future you is going to be even more of a badass. I don't know. Like, check my sources. Maybe he said it in a different way. But this is how I understood the power of those questions, that I'm suddenly invited to think about this future Michael, this grown Michael, this Michael who's more the person that I want to be in the future. And he's going to take care of the question, what's that going to look like? Because that is exciting.
I think that's spot on and exactly right, that when we think about the questions that we're asking, ultimately, the best questions are the ones that consider the full spectrum of possibilities, all of the potential that we have for living out these different futures and ideas. And this is why, I think also a really powerful question that we can ask ourselves, and a really powerful practice, and one that you have spoken so beautifully about, is this idea of kind of mental time travel, right? And asking what a future version of ourselves might come back and say to the, to the person today, or what we would have told a younger version of ourselves, or kind of writing letters to different versions. And I think, to me, the kind of mental time travel that we can do with some of these questions is also a fun way to imagine, to kind of open up the possibilities. And then also to see how kind of younger versions of ourselves might have fallen into similar traps that we're falling into, right? With thinking like, my life is definitely going to turn out this way, or this is definitely going to happen. Because I think sometimes with uncertainty, it's not always that we truly think we don't know what's going to happen. It's that we think we do know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's like, you think the worst is going to happen, or you think only two things could happen versus really sitting in the wonder of, I don't know what's going to happen. And you know what? A lot of great things could happen, right? I think uncertainty is aversive in part because we're like, all of these really bad things are probably going to happen to me, and so there's kind of this counterintuitive part of uncertainty where we're still clinging to certainty in that sense.
And even if the unfortunate thing happens, well, your mess is your message, right?
Yes.
That is now something that question can lead you towards. I have on my wrist, I have a tattoo from Viktor Frankl's book, The Doctor and the Soul. What is to give light must endure burning. And that to me is the negative outcome of something that is uncertain. Well, I'm glorifying that. I mean, if now the negative thing of an uncertain situation happens, it's still, not something to aspire to. But that is followed up by then the question, okay, what message comes out of this mess? What light comes out of this burning?
Yes, absolutely. And it's such a beautiful idea, and one that is really hard in the moment, I think, to appreciate, but is also, a big part of, I talk in the book about developing your own questions practice. And the best way to think about that is, it's like anything you are trying to regularly practice, right? Like a yoga practice or a meditation practice. It's just creating some time in your week or your day or your month to gain some awareness about the questions that are guiding your life, and to really understand, are those the questions that you want to be asking? Are there different or better questions?
How do we know that when we live a question, when we love a question, when it's one of those heartwood questions, how do we know that we're actually asking the right question? Because we could be loving a question that is leading us nowhere and should be the dead leaves. So how do we know? How do we test? How do we test that?
So in the book, I have a questions map. It's essentially like kind of a set of guided reflections for you if you're kind of feeling, if you're coming to the book, and I think a lot of people are coming to the book with maybe a feeling of unease, right? A sense of like, I'm uncertain about something. Maybe I'm going through a transition in my life. I'm asking a big question. I'm asking multiple big questions, and I'm feeling stuck. And so I think if you're feeling that way, you can kind of start with this map. And the idea of the map is to help you move forward and gain clarity on your questions, even if you're not getting an answer. And so, what I really start with is this step of, and there are kind of 4 components of a questions practice that I dive, deeply into in the book. They're the 4 C's: curiosity, conversation, community, and commitment. And we may not have time to go to all of them, but we'll start with the first one, right? Which is curiosity. And what that means is, how do we start to approach the questions in our lives that can be kind of the scariest, most painful questions with more curiosity than fear? And really, really hard, easier said than done, right? And so one of the ways to do it, we talked a little bit about, is trying to understand, is the question that I'm asking a binary question? And the other kind of tool to think about, and you alluded to this, is this question leading me back to myself? Is it an internal GPS, right? And so what I learned from my work is that the best questions are the ones that are not tethering me to the expectations that someone else, or I think the world, has for me, the should questions, right? That you alluded to, but the questions that are actually kind of leading me back to something that feels true and right and meaningful for me. And so maybe that's, aligned with my values, or maybe that's understanding what my values are in the first place. So that's part of it. And then the other part that I would say is does this question feel like it's kind of undermining my sense of agency, or my sense of kind of what I can do and who I can be? And I think, to that kind of dead leaves piece too, is the question holding me back? Is it keeping me stuck in kind of rumination and regret? So I think these are all of the questions that you can ask yourself to understand, is this the right question? So you've got that kind of, is it a binary? Is it like opening up possibilities for me, or is it limiting them kind of falsely? Is it an internal GPS? Is it leading me back to who I really am and what I really want? And then finally, is it keeping me stuck in the past in patterns of regret and rumination, or is it moving me forward? So those are kind of three things that I learned in my work. But I'm really curious too, Michael, for you, what have you learned about the best questions for your life? Kind of what resonates with you?
Oh, so much. If you could just see the highlights on all the notes that I took. So let me time travel to when I filled out this map, which, by the way, so it's somewhere in the middle of the book, and it's so actionable. The coolest thing about this map, it's 2 pages, and it looks like a pirate treasure map, which for someone like me, who's a pirate connoisseur, and someone who played through all the Monkey Island games, like pirate treasure maps, like give me one and I'm working through it. And then you have this really cool compass in there where you have the curiosity, conversation, community, and commitment. So the first thing that happened, and I apologize beforehand if I'm not answering your question directly, but going through that map, I was finding better questions. I was realizing that I was asking myself, so I'm not going to dig into the personal stuff that I was working through there, but I was asking myself a question that didn't work.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give you an example. That was not the question that I was asking, but if I'm asking myself a question like, why are you so stupid? Like, I'm not writing down a question that can be, like, it's not helping. I can ask myself, I can have this question keep me up for 15 nights and I'm not going to find, but reframe the question and find, what could I have done better today? And sounds like, wow, now we're looking at a question that is getting me somewhere. And it's not what would other people tell me that I could have done better today? What would Michael say that I could have done better? So this was a horrible example of using a made up question, but it was going through that map. And then you have something that the computer scientist in me appreciates is the yes and no. Like, is this question helpful? Yes or no? And then, of course, my answer was no. So, okay, next part in the treasure map is what's a better question to ask? And then you go into the questions of what do you need to learn? What's going to get in your way? This mental contrasting, the implementation intentions. Yeah. How is this actually going to look like? And by the way, Michael, when are you going to come back to this and check in and see what you've learned? So that it's not one of those things where you just, write something out about a question and then you leave it behind. It's like, no, like, when are you coming back to this and see how it worked? And I just love that piece of the accountability in there to myself. So I had to rush your book way more than I would have wanted to get ready for our interview. But this is something that I'm revisiting again and again and again. And by the way, so I want to add this because when you do a podcast, like, it's in the nature of the beast to kind of interview authors that have just written a book. It's kind of like, it's not ideal, but it's just how the machine of podcasting kind of works. And I am so glad that I found your book randomly going through Amazon. And what I want to say is that what you've put together there, the end product is a book, but really it is an idea that needs to make its way out there, because in your work as a change agent in the world is to bring that idea from the 1920s into the 21st century with the science, with the examples, with the story. And I just hope that this entire thing turns from a book to a movie franchise, to novels, video games, the entire ice cream, the entire shebang, because this has really made a difference in my life in looking at certain questions and be like, yeah, this is a beautiful question. Or, no, this is total BS. Like, this has nothing to do here. And so thank you for bringing that out into the world.
I'm so glad. It makes me so, I think when you're writing a book, you hope that my goal for writing the book was to help anyone grappling with big, challenging questions to feel a little bit less alone, because, to recognize that so many of us around the world, across time, right, are dealing with these big questions and big uncertainty. and to provide, tools that can help. And so it means so much to me to hear that it's helped in even a small way. And now you really do have me thinking about what would a loving the questions ice cream flavor be? And so this is a question that I will be carrying with me and trying to love. In addition to the movie, I love all of these ideas, but that in particular, I'm like, oh, this is a great question. So.
Yeah, I think there is going to be something about strawberries, something about vanilla, but a lot more M&Ms. I see M&Ms. But let's just lift the question a little bit more. And then I'll shoot you an email once I found the perfect combination for.
I can't wait.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I wish I could sit here with you for like 3 more hours and pick your brain on this. But for those of you who want to know more about you and what you're up to and where you're writing and doing your things, where can our listeners find more about you?
Yeah. So you can go to my website. It's just elizabethweingarten.com, first and last name. And I would love for folks to follow me on Substack. And my Substack is Time Travel for Beginners.
I'm so jealous. Oh, wow. Time Travel for Beginners. Yeah.
Well, I need to, as a fellow time travel enthusiast, I'm going to need to interview you for my Substack. So wait for that, because we're going to have to geek out a little bit more.
Thank you so much for everything you've done, Elizabeth. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me. This has been a real pleasure.
Me too. It was so much fun to chat with you, and so appreciate you bringing me on.
I am sitting here now with my co-host, Yael, for the Potsy post-host discussion of my interview with Elizabeth. And there is one question, Yael, that I would love to discuss with you or get your take on. And it's somewhat orthogonal to what I discuss with Elizabeth, but it's one of those questions that I'm living right now. There are 2 questions that I'm trying to solve in my life for humanity. And one is, what do we do with all this uncertainty that's going on? And the other one, and this is what this point in the discussion aims toward, is how does this authenticity work? When is authenticity appropriate? What does it even look like? I don't have any answers to that, but it's something that I love to experiment around with. And my introduction to my guest in this interview is such a great example for it. So I'll try to keep this brief, and then I want to hear your opinion on what happened and how it happened. So I had reached out to Elizabeth. I was very impressed with her work. It's like very one of those like, oh, is she even going to reply? Is her team even going to reply to my email? And Elizabeth wrote me back in person, and I had this like fanboy moment. And anyway, super impressed with her work. I finished reading through her book, and she made this little remark in the book in parentheses, a little, joke in the book where she wrote, I'm a huge time travel fan. I read all the books. I've seen all the movies, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I am too. So I reached out to her through email. I said, I just read this. This is so amazing. I also have read every book. We need to geek out over this. It was very enthusiastic. I was really almost questioning whether this email is appropriate, because I must have come across like a 12-year-old. Super excited about this. But what happened was that this was an email that immediately connected the 2 of us. She wrote back and she said, oh yeah, we're going to exchange notes on this. And then, I kid you not, when we started our interview, the first 20 minutes to 30 minutes, we talked about time travel movies, TV shows, what we love about it, and so on. From the first second, from the word hello, we were a kindred spirits. And so my question to you now is, how does this work? Or maybe I'll just bounce it towards you. I've been talking for long enough. Hi, Yael. What are your thoughts about that?
Hello, my dear Michael. So I have lots of thoughts both on uncertainty and on authenticity in sort of the relational realm. And interestingly, I've been sort of digging into some research and some writing from lots of people, including the famous Carl Rogers, the humanist psychologist who came up with client-centered therapy. And he's pretty well known for a lot of things. But one of the things that he talked a lot about, not actually as early in his career. This was more in his mid-career. He talked about the importance of something that he called congruence. So sort of showing up in the therapy room congruent with like how you feel on the inside and how important it is to be congruent with a client. That if you're angry, to not pretend you're not angry, but instead to sort of give voice to it so that the client knows that they can trust that what's on the outside kind of matches what's on the inside. And indeed, there is some research. It's a little bit hard to collect data on congruence. But what data there is, and I was recently reading this book that's written by Bill Miller and Terry Moyers. Bill Miller is one of the founders of motivational interviewing. And in this book, they review 70 years of research on psychotherapy and what makes for a good psychotherapist. And in one section, they talk about this idea of authenticity or congruence. And they find that indeed, when a therapist shows up in a more authentic way, in a way that the client perceives as being authentic, it predicts not only a better alliance, but also better treatment outcomes. And so there really is something to being authentic. And then the question is like, how much authenticity, right? Because it's not necessarily super helpful to say everything that's on your mind.
Exactly.
And for instance, like in research on like how authentic to be in, say, like your first date versus date 10, like you do want to be authentic, but you also want to be authentic in a particular way. So I think your question is such a good one, especially on the heels of an episode about questions, because I think it's not like, should I be authentic or not, but it's more, how can I be authentic in a way that nourishes relationships in this context, right? Whether it's like at the front end with somebody who you can tell has a similar interest than you. You know, geeking out about it is actually a terrific way to make a connection. But maybe you wouldn't demonstrate that level of authenticity about your passion for time travel with somebody who it was clear that that's not of interest to them. You could show a different authentic part of yourself. So I think it's more like, how can you show up authentically in the relationship context that you're in, given what you know? And I do think that what the research suggests is that, and I think what my personal experience suggests is like, it's better to err on the side of sharing more than less. We often predict that we'll get a worse response than we actually do, because we remember the times that it didn't go so well. And what we don't give a whole lot of attention to is all the times when it went really well. And one question that I'll just kind of pose is like, how often do you, Michael, or do you, dear listeners, really love the people who show up and share a lot and are vulnerable and kind of self-deprecating and, you know, share the things that you're like, oh, wow, I can't believe they share that. I love them for it. At least for me, that's how I feel. I'm always so grateful when people share more, even though I often feel self-conscious when I do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my working theory is that by being authentic, you can win. You might not, but you can. But if you're always holding back, you're not even in the game.
Exactly. Like, how can somebody get to know you if you don't share parts of yourself that would make you feel known?
Well, of course, you've listened to the interview. What were your thoughts on the conversation with Elizabeth?
Oh, gosh, I loved this conversation. I could tell that you guys were kindred spirits, and it was just like the far-reaching philosophical, like reflective kind of conversation that I absolutely love. And I will say that I love that you guys talked about the binary questions that we can fall into. And I would highly recommend sort of like pairing a fine wine with a good cheese, that if you really like this episode, that you should go check out the interview that I did with the author of a book, the co-author of a book called Both and Thinking. Her name is Marianne Lewis. And it talks all about this tendency, this almost reflex that we have to drop into these, should I do this or should I do that? Will it turn out this way or will it turn out that way? And she offers some really good tips. And one tip that I'll just share quickly here that I love in terms of question asking is beginning to develop a practice of noticing when we ask binary questions, and when we notice it, to see if we can turn it into a how question. So you had talked about the sort of substance abuse dilemma of like, will I stay clean or will I relapse? To turn that into a how question of like, how can I optimize my chances to stay clean? Because then it allows you to get more action-oriented and have a sense of agency and think more creatively. So she talks a lot about like how questions as being a way to engage our both and thinking processes.
I will say that for everyone like me who right now thinks, oh, wait, what was the name of that author that Yael just mentioned? What was the name of the interview? I just want to remind all of our listeners who don't know this, that for every episode that we put out in the show notes, both on the website and on your podcast feed, you find our list of curated and recommended episodes for the episode you're just listening to now. I don't know if people actually use this. I just know that we put quite an inordinate amount of work in finding related episodes for each one. So you'll find Yael's recommendation in there as well. Well, thank you so much, Yael. And I hope everyone enjoyed this interview with Elizabeth Weingarten.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our Rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.